Thanks, Tim. It's a privilege for me to be here, and especially with coaches. All of our data tell us that coaches are the singular most important influence on an athlete's life. And so that has multiple dimensions to it. So the influence can be physical and mental and social and spiritual, and it can be for the good and it can be for the bad. But the data are unequivocal that it's the coaches that are the first point. There are a couple of firsts I would just like to note that this is the first time in the history of the NCAA that Division I, Division II, and Division III are coming together for men and women and playing the championships in the same site. And so it's the sport of tennis which is leading the way. We hope that in 2027 going forward that this is going to be the model. That's when the next bids start coming up. This is the first time in, I think, the history of tennis that the USTA, the ITA, the NCAA, the ITA have had such an incredible working relationship. And this is the first time I'm giving a medical lecture in shorts. So, it's just so hot outside. Feel free to excuse that, but yeah. So difficult times in terms of what it is, what it represents. We're being challenged in the courts. We have over 600 concussions against us. They're mostly copycat lawsuits, meaning that they copy and paste. And for someone, I do a lot of writing, and what really gets me is that they even copy and paste the same grammatical errors. So it's just it's terrible. And as you know, there's the name, image, and likeness, which is sort of the genie out of the bottle right now. There are multiple states that have different laws, and we're trying to get that protected more centrally in Congress. We have a new president who's the former governor of Massachusetts. He's a Republican governor from a blue state, so he knows how to work across the aisle. So it's a very challenging time, but also a very exciting time. But the NCAA is not that well understood. Who are the NCAA? Well, it's 1,100 schools, and it's 100 divisions, or 100 conferences. So the conference can be the Big Ten, the SEC. A conference can be, the Ivy League or many others. And actually, Division III is our largest division. What you see on the TV about the NCAA, that represents less than 5%. When you're seeing a big-time college basketball game or football game, that comes from about 25, 30, maybe 50 schools. But the rest of the NCAA that we don't see on TV, that's really the heart of the NCAA. It's interesting when you look at students who are athletes, in the large Division I schools, it's about 1 in 25. But in Division III schools, there are many Division III schools with about 50% of these students are actually student athletes. And so it's a very different philosophical shift in terms of how they approach athletics. These are the three things that we stand for: academics, well-being, and fairness. And in terms of championships, and we're seeing 6 championships right now: men's and women's D1, D2, and D3. So that's 6 out of our 90 championships. Also, by the way, we're having an exhibition wheelchair collegiate championship as well. So that's going to be on the same Saturday as the D1 men's and women's. Really exceptional to see that. If you haven't seen wheelchair athletes compete, I just got back from Portugal for the World Team Cup, the world competition of wheelchair tennis, and happened to get to know the 12 U.S. players really well, and found out that one of the junior athletes lives less than a mile from me in New York. So we actually got together last week and did drills for like 2 hours, and it was pretty cool. But they're really exceptional athletes. The bottom line is we're a very tricky governance model. The Board of Governors, they have the ultimate authority, but it's a membership organization. So when people say, why doesn't the NCAA do this? Why doesn't the NCAA do that? Well, they can, but it's a representative democracy. So it takes 1,100 votes to get something done. So imagine just trying to get 1,100 schools to agree on something. So it's very challenging. So I'm the first NCAA chief medical officer, and you might say, well, why did it take the NCAA so long to have a chief medical officer? They were founded in 1906 for safety reasons. The reason the NCAA was founded was one reason only. It was to make the sport of American football safer. That's it. And then it evolved and evolved and evolved over time. But in terms of having a chief medical officer, actually the first national governing association or national governing body in the country who had a chief medical officer was the USTA. And that was me from 2008 to 2012. It was a part-time position, so it was a 20% position, which was really 100%. And then I had my full-time job otherwise. But after the NCAA hired a chief medical officer who followed the NFL, the NHL, the NBA, Major League Baseball. Now all of the governing bodies are developing chief medical officers. So we were actually a leader in that regard. But when I first met with what's called the Student Athlete Advisory Committee members, so these are, every school has a Student Athlete Advisory Committee, and then every conference has, and then the conference, they select those who are going to be the national, what's called staff members. And when I met with D1, D2, and D3 staff members, and I'm a neurologist, they all knew that, they all said the same thing. Dr. Hainline, we get concussion. Please make mental health the priority of the NCAA. I heard them loud and clear, and we said that we would. We assembled our first ever mental health task force in 2013. It was an incredible 4-day meeting, and every time we have a task force, it's the typical sort of thing that we put together. We have the content experts, and then we always have representatives from the student body. We always have coaches, and we have student athletes. Everyone during those 4 days, at one point in time, broke down in silence. Just about the difficulties, the challenges of mental health. And the coaches, when they broke down and cried, they said, yeah, we get mental health, but who's taking care of us and who cares about our mental health? Because they just want us to win. And so it was a very, very interesting dynamic. We went over some statistics I wanted to share with you. One of which is that when we really looked at the deaths of our student athletes, the third leading cause of death, as we were doing this mental health task force, was death by suicide. That's staggering. But then when we look at accidents, within accidents, what was a very, very common cause of accidents was death by inebriation. Alcohol, drug use, and then getting into an accident that really was entirely preventable. So these are major mental health challenges that are a huge cause of the death of our student athletes. And this is some really, really interesting data, and we have updates on it, but it's kind of the same. So we have data where we compare student athletes to their demographically similar students who are not athletes. And so we always hear, well, look at the challenge of athletes, and the NCAA doesn't take care of them, and they're so challenged with mental health, and they just drive them and drive them and drive them. But when we compare student athletes to athletes in areas such as depression, you see that students who are not athletes are more likely to be depressed than students who are athletes. Same thing for anxiety. And you might ask why? Well, I think everyone in this room is an athlete, and what do we do as athletes besides being competitive and striving for excellence? We learn how to fall down and pick ourselves up. We're surrounded by a family. We're very goal-oriented. Look at all of the things that are good for mental health and what it takes to be a great athlete. Doesn't mean that athletes don't have their problems, but again, when we download on the athletes and we get the data, what are their biggest concerns in terms of what causes depression and anxiety? Breaking up with your boyfriend and girlfriend, financial issues, family concerns. It's very, very rare that it's a sport concern. A couple other things that were interesting. This is where there's a difference between student athletes and athletes, is that male student athletes are more likely to have been aggressive or in some sort of a physical assault situation. Some other interesting data. I unfortunately don't have kind of specific data, but when I was able to break it down, it really was consistent with all other sports. So what are our kids doing? Kids, our emerging adults is actually the medically correct term. They aren't adults, they're emerging adults. When you look at their frontal lobes, so the frontal lobe is what differentiates human beings from other primates or from rats, for example. We do a lot of experiments with rats because the rat model of a brain is very similar to a human model of a brain. Their behavior is very similar to human behavior, except for one thing. Rats aren't going to blow up the world, whereas humans may well end up blowing up the world. And, but our frontal lobe is what helps us with our decision making, and it's very important in emerging adults, which means between 18 and 24 years old. The myelin in the frontal lobe, the myelinization, which is really what helps form the connections and the speed of decision making, it's still very actively developing in this age group. So they are not fully adult, although they can go to war and fight for our country and be killed for our country and defending it, and they can do a lot of other things, but still, from a neurophysiological point of view, they're still in a very critical developmental stage. But for our young adults, emerging adults, they're spending our tennis players, on maybe 30 hours a week on athletic activities. And what would they like to be doing? Well, the women basically don't necessarily want to spend more time, and the men are a little split on that, but they're closer to 50%. They want to spend even more time. What about academic activities? It's about 40 hours a week. So our young men and women are putting in 60 to 80 hour work weeks, essentially. And academically, they want to do even more. So I'm going to get to a theme of sleep, but if you think about it, athletics, academics, that's 70 hours. Socializing, what's the one thing that they believe they can skimp on because they're invincible? Is sleep. And I'll just get right to the point about sleep, that sleep disorders predict musculoskeletal injuries more than overtraining does. I'll say that again. If you have an athlete who has a sleep disorder, is not getting the proper sleep, that will predict a musculoskeletal injury more than overtraining. Sleep disorders predict mental health disorders. Sleep disorders put you at a higher risk of suicidal ideation. And for any of you who are not getting enough sleep, sleep disorders are one of the independent predicting variables for developing Alzheimer's. Because if you don't move into stage 4 sleep, that's the time when the brain is clearing the toxins. There's something called the lymphatic system of the brain, and it's critically important. And without that, then there's the development of neurotoxins, which actually predispose to degenerative changes. I'll sometimes go off on a tangent like that. How often have you felt that difficulties were piling up so high you could not overcome them? Well, you can see across the board, it's roughly about a third of our athletes. So just think about it. Your tennis players are no different. This is what they are perceiving, that things are so challenging for them that they don't feel they can overcome them. So we had data like that, and it led us to developing what are called the NCAA mental health best practices. And I'm just going to go through this a little bit. But this document was endorsed by 25 of the leading medical, scientific, and mental health organizations in the country, saying this is the best way to do mental health for our college athletes. We started off with this really cool book called Mind, Body, and Sport. So this was one of the 9, but it's actually, it's okay. It's not the greatest book, but it actually has some great stories in it. But this is the mental health best practices. And all we did was divide it into 4 things. So one thing I'm going to talk about is clinical licensure. On your college campus, we say in the book that every coach should know who the licensed mental health providers are. Every coach should know that. Most sports psychologists are not licensed mental health providers. They're coaches. They're kinesiologists. So that's a very important distinction. The second is the referral patterns for routine and emergency mental health care. We state unequivocally that every coach should have been part of a well-rehearsed emergency action plan for mental health. What's an emergency mental health problem? Suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, having just been a victim of sexual or interpersonal violence, drug overdose, psychosis, delusions, paranoia. Just like if someone were to drop down right now and have a cardiac arrest, every single person in this room should be trained in CPR and automatic external defibrillation, because you can save a life. We know with 100% certainty that if you deliver CPR and automatic external defibrillation within 3 minutes, there's a 92% chance that that person's going to have a normal survival. Just like we saw with the collegiate players can, but on the NFL sideline, they have more than most emergency rooms have on our sideline. But every coach is supposed to be trained in that, and every coach is supposed to be trained in how to do a mental health emergency action plan. That's actually an NCAA legislation. And so what do we do if someone has suicidal ideation? The first thing we do is not. The second thing we do is we don't leave their side until they're professional help. That's an emergency action plan right there. Then we talk about screening, and then this is a critical part, a health promoting environment. This is where we go to the data that I cited when I first started talking with you, that coaches are the single most important influence in an athlete's life. And then coaches, more than anyone else, have the primary responsibility for setting up two things. One is an environment that fosters wellness, and two, an environment that says that mental health care seeking should be as normal as seeking help for a sprained ankle. They're the same. They're both going to impair your ability to perform. They both impair with your day-to-day well-being. It's on the coaches. Why? Because coaches are the greatest educators in athletics and perhaps in life. So that was, that's basically it in a nutshell. And then it became legislation. So every one of the 1,100 member schools is supposed to have a policy in place that is consistent with the mental health best practices. We, during COVID, we noticed that there was a lot of difficulties with our student athlete, with our coaches, with our full-time NCAA staff. I mean, it was a very, very difficult and challenging time for everyone. But we wanted to get a handle on this, so we did some surveys. And this might be a little bit much to see it, I don't want to get in the way. But the survey is basically, we started in the spring of 2020. So remember COVID, the date that we all had, like they were yesterday, March 11th, 2020, when we announced to the world that the Final Four was going to be without fans. March 12th, one day later, this is how fast the information was coming in, we announced to the world that we were canceling all winter and spring championships, including the Final Four. That was an $850 million decision. But it was the right decision to make, ethically, scientifically, morally. So, the orange are female, the blue are males, and just comparing the spring of 2020, the fall of 2020 to the fall of 2021, you can see that mental exhaustion is pretty much standard across the board. Sleep difficulties improve, but you still have 28% of females and 19% of males who are having sleep difficulties. Feeling overwhelming anxiety, it's still pretty high, so feeling sad. So it has gone down. But when you're with someone who has no sense of hope, they're not connected to life. In the same way, if you have hope. And how do we understand that as a coach? That my athlete feels hopeless. You can often see it in their eyes. I remember as Chief Medical Officer of the US Open for 16 years and getting to work with the athletes really, really closely, you could just tell looking in the athlete's eyes who was going to be on the tour 6 months from now. They just weren't there. They were disconnected. So that's a very important survey. And this is also some information that's very interesting that we just got. And this slide really upsets me considerably. Given that we have the legislation that we've been doing as much as we can, but at the college campus level, Is mental health a priority, and is everyone doing what they need to do to make certain that mental health is delivered to everyone? So we ask men and women, I know where to go on campus if I have a mental health concern. Well, it seems pretty good. 69% of the women know where to go. 63% of the men know where to go. But that means more than 30% don't. That's worrisome. I know how to help a teammate who has experienced a mental health issue. Only a little more than half. Has anyone ever heard of bystander intervention? It's really phenomenal. And it was primarily developed for sexual violence. So, if you have a typical, bystander intervention, and I'm going to be very binary here, but say you have, a guy, and then you have a couple of guys, and you have a gal, and everyone's drinking, and one guy is the predator. And it's just waiting until the woman becomes drunk enough that basically he's going to have an opportunity to violate her in the most horrific of ways. And you see that, but the bystander effect means that you see something terrible going on, like someone giving a chokehold and killing someone on a New York City subway, and you don't do anything. That's the bystander effect. Bystander intervention means that you know how to intervene. You get in that person's way, you distract them, or you are protecting the person who's the potential victim, but you understand how to intervene. And this is what all of our student athletes need to know how to do for each other as well. Someone's kind of drifting, they're not showing up at practice, they're aloof, they're looking sad, they're looking disengaged. How do we intervene with them? You don't have to be an expert. You just have to be someone who's confident, who cares, and who is competent at a really basic level. I would feel comfortable seeking support from a mental health provider on campus. Not very many. There's a lot that don't. That's a stigma. As coaches, we have the best opportunity to reduce the stigma of mental health care seeking. We would never dream of not having someone seek help for a sprained ankle or rotator cuff problem. But for mental health, it has to be at the same level. My coaches take mental health concerns seriously. 59% of men say that their coaches do, 50% of women say that their coaches do. Not a high enough level. My teammates take mental health concerns of fellow teammates seriously. It's the majority, but still there's room for improvement. And I feel that student athletes' mental health is a priority to our athletics department, only at about 50%. That should be at 100%. So we have a long way to go, and we're now, and we're doing a lot of workshops. Let's call this a workshop as well. What can we do to make it better? Because we're obviously not succeeding. We also had a summit during COVID, and one of the things that we realized was that, well, let's put it this way, 90% of licensed mental health providers in this country are white. And for a certain segment of our athletes, especially our Division I basketball and football athletes, the majority are black. The minority of coaches are black. And there's this cultural insensitivity, one could say, especially for athletes of color, for the LGBTQ plus community, and for our international athletes. Now that certainly impacts a lot of the coaches in this room who have international athletes as well. They feel that people don't understand them well. And it's from experiences, you can, I can understand cognitively when a black athlete tells me that her life growing up or his life growing up in Detroit was maybe much different than my life growing up. I can get that cognitively, but do I understand it viscerally? Do I have that experience? And so we really try to dig into cultural sensitivity issues and kind of develop this model where we're trying to understand how we address cultural sensitivity issues at every level. And we came up with some basic consensus of statements. But we had to delay putting them out. And here's the main reason why we had to delay putting them out. Because this was a group of experts. These were academics, these were student athletes, these were coaches, and we went through this process called the Delphi method, which is a scientifically validated process for coming to consensus when you have certain levels of evidence. And one of the statements that they said was that athletics departments, including coaches and everyone else, should be educated about the history of racism in healthcare, the history of racism in sports. And we were told, can't put that up. We weren't told it was too low, but almost. But we pushed, and that's out there for everyone. This is what the NCAA believes is important. And in response to that and a lot of other things, we put together yet a new mental health advisory group. And I'm just going to go through this very quickly, but we're going through an awful lot of material, and in January 2024, we're going to have a completely updated mental health best practice, which is going to incorporate a lot of the new and emerging data. It's going to incorporate our cultural sensitivity data. So that's the essence of where we are with the NCAA. This next part I'm just going to go through very quickly. There was a first ever International Olympic Committee symposium on mental health and elite athletes. I was privileged to be co-chair of that. And we came up with a lot of papers. It was a great amount of work. But this was really an important one where we talked about sleep. And I've already downloaded you on that. But I'll say it again. If your athletes aren't sleeping, their first serve percentage is going to be off. They're going to be double volume more. They're going to be making more unforced errors. And when they're really going to be having problems and why they're going to get musculoskeletal injuries? Because their deceleration is on. You think about them. You're tired. What's the most critical aspect of footwork and tennis? Well, we could have a debate about that, right? So certainly the split step is, the side step is, the acceleration is, but where do the injuries happen? It's the deceleration. And that's where the injuries happen when you're sleeping. We went through some other things, and I want to we looked at cultural influencers for those who take care of international athletes. Again, I can't stress how important that is. Something happened. And I'm just going to end with this, and I can get this for distribution. We put together 2 tools. This is the first ever sports mental health assessment tool. It's the first sports-specific screening tool ever done. Because athletes are kind of weird sometimes too. They might be serving, and they're going through all these things, and you would think that they have an obsessive compulsive disorder, but this is their ritual. Athletes have ritual because that helps them normalize their behavior, and it puts them in control. And as well as anyone, that when you feel you're in control, well, that's when you're going to hit your race. And so the rituals help us get that sense of control. But we did a sports mental health recognition tool for coaches. It's a 1-pager, and it's a red light, green light, yellow light. And if you have an athlete who's in the red light zone, you have to deal with it. And so I can get that, and we can have that distributed, Tim. But I think that's really it. I just want to give you a little bit of a download on where we are with mental health. And I'll just end again. It's a privilege for me to be with you all, and we recognize the importance. You're all educators, and you're really educating not only our emerging adults and how to be better tennis players, but you're also in the human development business, and that's what we're doing more than anything. and understanding mental health and how to work with it is just really important. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for, let's hear it.